On July 12, 2008, Jenna Hewitt and her friends were walking by the beach when they stumbled across a dead body. It wasn't of any animal they could identify. It looked like a four-legged animal with a beak. Pictures of this corpse went viral, and the animal was dubbed the Montauk Monster after Montauk, New York. No one was able to identify the animal, and its body vanished before samples were taken. Who took it? No one knows. More importantly, what was it, and where did it come from? Residents suspected that it was the result of experiments taking place at the nearby Plum Island. And the residents had a good reason to believe that. You see, Plum Island is home to the PIADC, an animal disease center that conducts research on animals. But that's their social media profile. Behind the scenes, this island was used for biological warfare research, some so hideous and scary that it makes movies like The Human Centipede sound PG-13. The government's stance in all this is that all such research was stopped, but with the discovery of the Montauk Monster, such claims started looking shaky at best and outright false at worst. And when you consider the island's history, it's even harder to believe that nothing shady is going on at Plum Island. From 1952 to 1954, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps researched ways to weaponize highly transmissible diseases that affect animals. These diseases could theoretically ruin a rival nation's food supply and starve them overnight. A starving army is already an easily defeated army. So when you have an island that no one can visit without top-secret clearance, and it has a documented history of being used for bioweapons research, it is hard to believe that nothing sinister is happening behind the scenes. But the government would like you to look the other way, which is why the island has nothing to do with the Army Chemical Corps anymore, at least on paper. After just 2 years on the island, the Chemical Corps packed its bags and left, handing over the island to the Department of Agriculture. Now it's being used for harmless animal research. That's what the government would want you to think. But how could anyone buy that story when the island itself is controlled by Homeland Security? You could literally have an invitation from the head of the USDA, which is the Secretary of Agriculture, and you would still not be able to get on the island without clearance from Homeland. Even the daily operations of the island are managed by Homeland Security, and for a good reason. See, the very first biological weapon researched at Plum Island during the Cold War was FMD. FMD, or foot and mouth disease, is so infectious and fast-spreading that if it is found in just one cow in a country, other countries stop importing beef from it. In 2001, a few cows in the UK tested positive for FMD. Within days, hundreds more started testing positive. To contain the disease, 6 million cows, pigs, and sheep were slaughtered. 15% of the country's sheep and 7% of all its cattle were slaughtered, and their bodies burned to protect the rest of the country. When FMD was found in Taiwan, 40% of the country's pigs were slaughtered to contain the disease. That's what happens when FMD naturally reaches a part of the country. But if it is weaponized and strategically activated in multiple parts of the target country, it would lead to starvation and chaos. The U.S. bioweapons program at Plum Island was researching FMD. It was their first candidate for a bioweapon agent. The bioweapons program was shut down, but today the Department of Agriculture is conducting research on Plum Island. And guess what their primary focus is? It's FMD. So, the government is still researching FMD, the same disease that the Chemical Corps wanted to turn into a weapon. If that's what the government admits to, what else is it doing that we don't know? After the Montauk Monster incident, another creepy carcass was discovered in the same city of New York, this time under the Brooklyn Bridge. It was dubbed the Manhattan Monster. The Parks Department declared it a pig, but the carcass had claws instead of hooves, which means that whatever it wasn't a pig. Something weird was happening to the animals, but it didn't stop at just the animals alone. In 2010, a human body was found on Plum Island's beach, where no public is allowed. The autopsy revealed that the decomposed body belonged to a 6-foot male with unusually long fingers. While the cops said there were no signs of foul play or trauma, they also accepted that his skull had indications of prior neurosurgery. At the time of his death, he had anti-seizure meds, phenobarbital, and Dilantin in his system. To this day, we do not know who he was, where he came from, and how he died. In 2023, another dead body washed up on Plum Island, this time in a boat. And just like the events of 2010, we still don't know anything about the recent one. Are these people who got too curious and sneaked onto the island? Are these insiders who knew too much? Or are they the subjects of human experimentation? The last possibility is the scariest because the government has a track record of experimenting on its own citizens. In 1932, the government promised free health care to 600 African American men in Alabama's Macon County, which of course any reasonable person would gladly jump on. But instead of giving them any treatment, the doctors from the U.S. Public Health Service just gave them sugar pills and aspirin because they wanted to study the full progression of the disease they had. That disease was syphilis, which led to the death of 128 participants from direct and related causes. Syphilis can also be transmitted through intercourse, and this had been known for decades. But the participants were not told that they had syphilis. Instead, they were told that they were being treated for bad blood. So by the time the study was stopped due to an Associated Press expose, 40 spouses had contracted the disease, and it had also passed to 19 children at birth. To this day, the Tuskegee experiment is remembered as one of the darkest chapters of American history. But thankfully, the government can't get away with human experiments these days because of tighter regulations. Participants could turn around and sue the government. But what of those who can't? Those whose rights are rightfully stripped away because they were rightfully convicted of a crime? Well, there's plenty of that. If the government can't find human samples from suburban neighborhoods, it can find plenty of guinea pigs in its prisons. As NPR puts it, every year 10 million people funnel in and out of America's jails and prisons, and every year some of them get lost. In the past, the U.S. government has used prisoners for its experiments. From injecting 64 prisoners with cow blood to injecting more than 400 prisoners with malaria, the guys in power have done it all. In 1950, 200 female prisoners were given viral hepatitis in a University of Pennsylvania experiment. Then, there was the time when Ohio State convicts were injected with live cancer cells to examine the progression of the disease. If the government admits to doing all that, is it really that far-fetched to say that there are still human experiments going on at top-secret government facilities, like Plum Island? The answer to that question is no, especially when you see who helped launch the Plum Island facility. During the Second World War, Germany had a bioweapons program on Roms Island. Erich Traub was the scientist overseeing this deadly program. He worked directly with Himmler, who worked directly with Hitler. When the Nazis lost, the Soviets imprisoned Traub on Roms Island and forced him to continue his research, but for them. This disturbed the US because Traub was an expert in FMD. If the Soviets used his expertise and developed a potent enough bioweapon, they would become the global superpower. In 1948, the British carried out a high-priority mission and evacuated Traub from Roms Island, delivering him to the US the very next year. It's no secret that America recruited and pardoned Nazis under its Operation Paperclip to get ahead of the Soviets. Erich Traub was one of these Nazis, and he visited the Plum Island facility on 3 separate occasions. For most of his tenure, Traub was stationed in America's largest biochemical weapons research center, Fort Detrick. Some people might say that importing Nazis was okay as long as it helped the US establish its dominance. But think about it, is trusting a Nazi master of bioweapons with a lab a good idea? You can answer that question in the comments. Traub's main focus was on using insects as a delivery mechanism for diseases. He wanted to turn ticks into bullets. And it seems like he did, just in the wrong place. Sources say that Traub experimented with ticks carrying Lyme disease, which didn't have a name back then. Soon after, a town just 10 miles away from Plum Island had its first major outbreak of that disease. That town was Lyme, Connecticut, and it is what the disease is named after. The question is, did Nazi Erich Traub intentionally unleash Lyme disease on Americans, or were the residents of Lyme, Connecticut the unfortunate victims of a government-sponsored experiment? It's certainly plausible. The government has previously conducted experiments on unsuspecting citizens. Ever heard of Operation Sea Spray? The U.S. military spent 6 days spraying bacteria over San Francisco just to test how vulnerable the city was to a bioweapon attack. Residents most likely inhaled millions of bacterial spores over the course of the test. And here's the worst part. The government conducted hundreds of similar tests as a part of its biowarfare program. Then, in 1969, President Richard Nixon issued an order to halt all germ warfare research. Most people believe that this was simply a public relations move and that the program simply went underground. On paper, all superpowers, alongside 180 other countries, have agreed to uphold the Biological Weapons Convention. However, the U.S. suspects China, North Korea, and Russia of secretly running bioweapons programs. Then why would it not run a secret program of its own, especially when it's super easy to hide a bioweapons lab as a disease research facility? The truth is that pretty much any country could cheat on the Biological Weapons Convention because it has no verification or inspection procedures. There are no criteria to determine whether a lab is researching diseases to prevent them or to weaponize them, but one way to tell what a lab holds is to see who is interested in it, and you won't believe who had their eyes on the Plum Island facility. On July 17, 2008, police in the Ghazni province of Afghanistan received complaints about a woman in a burqa going around encouraging other women to volunteer for terrorist activities. Soon after, an officer spotted a woman crouching with what looked like heavy bags under her burqa. She was cautiously taken into custody, and to the officer's surprise, the woman was not from Afghanistan. In her possession were numerous chemical substances in bottles and jars. She had 2 pounds of sodium cyanide, which can be lethal in even small doses. But the scariest thing in her possession was a set of notes. These handwritten notes referred to a mass casualty attack in the U.S. Also in her possession was a list of targets, including Plum Island. The woman was eventually extradited to the U.S., where she was sentenced to 86 years in prison. She was dubbed Lady Al-Qaeda because of her connection to the terrorist organization. But what made her different from other Al-Qaeda operatives was her education. Lady Al-Qaeda's real name is Dr. Afia Siddiqui. She received her bachelor's in biology from MIT and a PhD in neuroscience from Brandeis University. So this wasn't a random operative picking a random target. This was someone with specialized knowledge aiming at Plum Island for an unknown but important reason. Was Siddiqui trying to unleash America's own bioweapons on its citizens? It's plausible, because the facility does have samples of FMD, samples that have previously leaked from the lab. There have been a total of 3 instances where FMD leaked from the Plum Island lab, but since the lab is on the island, the virus was contained. In extreme cases, all animals on the island were slaughtered and their bodies were burned. At this pace, terrorists might not need to blow up the facility to let the virus out. The government's own incompetence will get the job done, like the time when a CDC lab shipped live anthrax to other labs that weren't equipped to handle the samples. 62 CDC employees might have been exposed to the deadly bacteria. In another case, a CDC lab turned a minor flu sample into a deadly specimen by accidentally contaminating it with a strain of bird flu. The CDC shut down its flu and anthrax labs and put a stop to all relevant shipments to prevent further accidents. There are dozens of examples where infectious samples were leaked, stolen, or accidentally shipped out of government facilities, and even one accident like this can cause a nationwide medical emergency. But if harboring viruses, even for research purposes, is so risky, why do we even do it? because the cost of not doing it is even greater. Countries that don't conduct such research are sitting ducks in front of countries that do. And that became clear when the entire population of Cuba almost starved to death because of what looked like a bioterror attack. In 1971, Cuba had an outbreak of African swine fever. 500,000 pigs had to be slaughtered, which devastated the country's food supply. The production of all pork-related goods was halted for a few months, delivering a tough blow to Cuba's economy. At that time, Cuba was led by Fidel Castro, a dictator that the CIA desperately wanted to overthrow. So did the CIA have something to do with the outbreak? The Cuban government definitely thought so, and they had a good argument. Before African swine fever surfaced in Cuba, it was not found in the entire Western Hemisphere. The only other place in the West with samples of this virus was Plum Island. So the simplest explanation was that the virus was shipped from Plum Island to Cuba, and the narrative picked up steam when an American newspaper, Newsday, found a source to back that claim. The source told Newsday that they were handed containers bearing the virus at a U.S. military base. They were asked to turn over the containers to anti-Castro rebels after reaching Cuba. The accounts of these sources lined up with the movements of U.S. military transport vessels. If this was true, then the CIA was guilty of defying the orders of President Nixon, who had very publicly shut down the U.S. biological warfare program. This was serious. So, a Senate committee was set up to look into what happened in Cuba and whether the CIA had anything to do with it. Of course, the CIA denies any involvement in the incident. That was expected. But what wasn't expected was the presence of Ahmed Dardari. Dardari was an expert in African swine fever. And where was he stationed? In Plum Island. Dardari was the lab chief of diagnostic research at the facility, and what he said back then should concern everyone, even today. He said that there were no vaccinations that could prevent African swine fever. He also told the committee that if the swine fever were to break out in the States, all the pigs would need to be slaughtered. To this day, things haven't changed much for America. As Dr. Harry Snelson, the executive director of the American Association of Swine Veterinarians, puts it, the U.S. swine herd is a 100% naive population, and an introduction of the virus into any pigs in the U.S. would eliminate our export markets immediately. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, is said to have weaponized wheat cover smut to essentially starve his rivals. And there is growing evidence that China is actively working on weaponizing viruses that harm cattle and crops. So the US government needs to keep researching the riskiest plant and animal diseases to be able to protect its citizens from starvation. On paper, Plum Island is just a place where government scientists develop vaccines. And vaccines might sound more innocent than bioweapons, but even the research stage of vaccines can get pretty dark. 10-year-old Nina Galen had special needs. She was severely autistic, and her mother wanted to enroll her in an institution that could help her. This was before 1970, so there weren't a lot of places that could help little Nina. The biggest was Willowbrook State School, which in 1965 was the biggest state-run institution for children with mental disabilities. The school was designed to accommodate 4,000 students, but had 6,000, and the line for enrollment was pretty long. Little Nina's mom had no hope until Dr. Krugman offered her the opportunity to jump the line and get little Nina into a new research ward at the school. Nina's mom agreed and enrolled her 10-year-old in the school. That's how Nina ended up becoming a test subject in one of the darkest experiments in the history of medicine. Dr. Krugman and his partner tested a preliminary version of the hepatitis B vaccine on children with disabilities. The experiment ran from 1955 to 1970, and during its course, children were injected with the virus itself or were given chocolate milk mixed with the feces of other infected kids. Krugman was recognized and honored for his work. At one point, the doctors allowed the children to recover and then gave them the virus all over again to see if patients with a history of the disease could get it again. So, the government has conducted human experiments before. But that could not be happening at Plum Island, because the facility there deals with animals, right? Not necessarily. See, there is a set of diseases that can transfer from animals to humans, like a certain virus that caused a global lockdown after getting transferred from a bat to a human. These diseases are called zoonotic diseases, and the Homeland Department's own website on the Plum Island facility admits to encountering and working with zoonotic diseases. To research zoonotic diseases that affect both animals and humans, you would need both animal and human test subjects. Zoonotic diseases are also a Pandora's box because they apply to animals as well as humans. So, the government can pretend to be researching a zoonotic disease for food security, and no one would question why a government lab has vials upon vials of zoonotic viruses that affect animals. It's to protect our cattle. But what most people don't realize is that those viruses can also be weaponized against humans. Zoonotic diseases give the government a perfect cover to hide biological weapons research. So why isn't the media covering this 24/7? You can say that the American media is owned by the deep state, but why isn't foreign media shedding more light on this? Chinese newspapers have published a few stories on Plum Island, but for the most part, both domestic and foreign media have ignored this facility. And that's because every dark claim has an innocent explanation. Some individuals believe we blew this out of proportion, despite the mountain of historical proofs. Starting with the Montauk Monster, which, according to Wired.com, is a dogfighting washout, but no dogfighting spots have been uncovered around the area. Another explanation is that the Montauk Monster could be a raccoon, a bloated and decomposed raccoon, but we wouldn't know because the body vanished shortly after it was photographed. But what about the human body that washed up on Plum Island? It ended up on Plum Island, but it seemed to have washed up from another location. The government could have done a better job of hiding the body if it came from Plum Island, or perhaps they were trying to hide it in plain sight. As for Lyme disease, it's been traced back to a 5,000-year-old mummy of Otzi the Iceman, so the government definitely did not invent Lyme disease. But did they load it up in ticks and unleash it on Lyme, Connecticut? Who knows? Finally, there is the African swine fever outbreak in Cuba, which has the weakest explanation. The CIA's stance is that the virus reached Cuba via cured meat from Europe. This was in 1971, and Europe had no instances of African swine fever until 2007. Whether you believe what the government is doing on Plum Island is innocent or evil, you cannot be sure that it is competent enough to do it safely, because in the past, breaches at government labs have gotten people killed. Honestly, I don't believe a word of whatever excuse is being given for Plum Island. It's all shady with a rich history of lies and death. For 10 years since 2005, the U.S. Army Dugway Proving Ground accidentally shipped live anthrax to dozens of labs at least 74 times. Army biological researcher Bruce Ivins became the prime suspect for stealing and weaponizing anthrax, which was used in a string of attacks in 2001. 22 people got infected, and 5 of them died. So, deadly viruses, even in government custody, can be leaked by accident or be stolen by rogue agents. If any of this is making you anxious, then you'll be happy to know that the facility at Plum Island is shutting down this year. But sorry to burst your bubbles quickly, because it is being replaced by a new facility in Kansas, right in the middle of America. Remember the 3 cases of foot and mouth disease getting out of the Plum Island facility? All of those instances were contained because Plum Island is literally an island. All animals on the island were slaughtered and the problem was fixed. Now, the same research will be conducted in the heart of Tornado Alley in a state that produces a lot of food. What could possibly go wrong?